book alone is the Confederados, Old South Immigrants in Brazil. There are dozens of books on this topic, and I have been blessed beyond measure to have found at least 5 families that our family is related to there. And most of them came from Montgomery. As Jerry mentioned, our family's been in Alabama long before statehood in 1819, so we're kind of old Alabama soil. And most of the Confederados met in Port of Mobile, Alabama, and then sailed down to Brazil and other points. But that's not what I want to talk about tonight. Sandy Mott, our dear Sandy, when Judy asked me if I would take some time and speak tonight, Sandy said, "I know what I want you to speak about." And I'm happy to do that. First of all, can everyone hear me without
talk a little louder?
I can do that for you. All right. I did write a lot of notes down, and I will have to put my glasses on because of allergies to not hear. Everybody's here. Everyone has a face. Good. I wanted to start out with a quote by George Orwell. George Orwell was not a Christian man, at least not that we knew of. His purpose in life was not to spread the gospel or anything other than truth. First quote I would like to say tonight from George Orwell. He wrote a book called 1984. It was published in 1939 and is more precise and to the point today than I believe it's ever been. The first quote is, "The further a society drifts from truth, the more it will hate those who speak it." The further a society drifts from truth, the more society will hate those who speak it. So we're here tonight honoring our beloved, some of ancestors and some just heroes. And we're here to remember them. We're here to honor them. We're here to memorialize them. And we're here to remember the cause that they fought for. Because that's why we're here. But there are forces working against us in remembering these wonderful principles. And I wanted to draw 3 parallels. One of them is what happens every year in Latin America. I am so honored and just blessed to be able to work in areas where I get to see other cultures. One of the most fascinating cultures to me is the Latino culture. Every year on our Halloween, October 31st, and then through the night and into the morning of All Saints' Day, November 1st, they have the most intriguing ceremony. It's called Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos. And there's a movie out, a Disney movie out called Coco that's got all of this, but it's to music, which is kind of cute. But every year on the Day of the Dead, our Halloween, they gather in their families, with their families, and they have an ofrenda, an altar place. They call it an ofrenda. If they don't have a picture of their ancestor or their family member who has passed away, they put their name on the ofrenda, on the offering, on the altar. And what they do is every year they honor their ancestor. Now, when the last person stops remembering, they say that the person's soul can no longer come back over to commune with their family. So guess what? It behooves the family to remember every one of their ancestors. They say their names. They look at their pictures. Or they look at the name written. And every year, they take it as their responsibility as a family, to remember their ancestors. Okay, that's every year. Now, there was I don't know if you know this. I didn't really realize that the next group that I wanted to draw a parallel with was the Holocaust. It's just over 70 years ago was the Jewish Holocaust. 70 years. There was a New York Times, New York Times poll that said 41% of Americans, and specifically 66% of American millennials surveyed, do not know what the word Auschwitz symbolizes. Let that sink in. 41% of Americans, specifically 66% of those American millennials surveyed, do not know what Auschwitz was. Remember, that's just over 70 years ago. There are people in this room who are over 70. All right. Now, the survey concluded, and this is in quotes, the Holocaust is fading from memory. It is being forgotten. I have a friend named Sherry Fleischman. The name Fleischman is obviously a Jewish name. She wrote me a note when I was telling her I wanted to have a quote from her about, oh, by the way, Holocaust Remembrance Day, Holocaust Memorial Week actually is in April, which I think is significant that our Confederate Memorial is also in April. So it's a very interesting parallel there. So Sherry, who is this lovely former Trans-World Airlines flight attendant, now American Airlines flight attendant, said, on Holocaust Memorial Day, I urge you to pick up a history book, and you'll realize what happens when you give up freedoms, and you will know why we have them. What she was telling me was, make sure to tell people never forget. Pick up a history book, remember, and learn. So the next thing that I wanted to draw the parallel with, we went from something that's done every day in the Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, then something more recent, 70 years plus ago, with the Holocaust Memorial. Now, do you know how many years ago it's been since the signing of the Peace of Appomattox? Here, it's in 2020, 155 years ago. And yet, look at this group. And we're not the only group, by the way, that's celebrating Lee and Jackson. We're not the only group that meets every month. There are people all throughout the United States and throughout the world who still get together to commemorate our Confederate Memorial Day. So, with our gathering, with the Lee, Jackson, honoring their birthdays and their lives and their characters, we have detractors who are hard at work trying to keep us from being here doing what we're doing right now. George Orwell, I mentioned before, wrote the book 1984. It's supposed to be the super futuristic 1984. How long ago was that? It was printed again in 1939. I'm going to use a quote out of that book and see how pertinent it is for right this minute. And remember, this is not a Christian book. It's not a historical book. It's not a Confederate history book. It's basically a work of fiction. But he says, every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book has been rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue, every street building has been renamed. Every date has been altered, and the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute, and history has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present. Once again, that was published in 1939. So, I have wondered, I'm sure we all have wondered what the agenda is. Who's behind renaming, removing, changing, repainting, removing street names? Who's behind it? Well, I found a quote, and the date is very important. It's January 12th, that's tomorrow, 1990. 30 years ago tomorrow, this quote was published by a man named Kweisi Mfume, former president and CEO of the NAACP, a 5-term Democratic congressman from Maryland's 7th District. And this is all in quotes. As such, our principal objection and litigant efforts until now had been directed to the Confederate flag use as an official symbol. However, we feel we're at a crossroad and feel that a compromise would not be beneficial to anyone. In the near future, efforts will be aimed at the removal of racist names, mascots, monuments, and ending the glorification of Confederate soldiers through what is termed reenacting. We also feel there could be better use of state and federal resources by closing museums and battlefields, which are dedicated to the preservation of slavery. These funds can be put to more productive use for society as a whole. 30 years ago tomorrow, that quote was printed. The agenda is to wipe it all out. Wipe us out. Wipe the ancestors' memories out. But because today our detractors are bold and blatant, and they're choking the courts with their lawsuits, trying to rename schools, streets, destroying and vandalizing monuments. They're even trying to put into context, that's a new trigger word for them. They're trying to put in, our detractors are trying to put into context historical events and historical documents. I just read this recently. It was in a book written by Sarah Palin, and she had a visit to Washington, D.C. There were in the museums, in the gift shops, in several of the museums she visited, there were context stickers on copies of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States of America. Here's what the warning said. The warning was written on a contextual sticker in parentheses. It was written in an era of different sensibilities by slave-holding white supremacists. Is a sticker on the United States, a copy of the United States Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, written. This document was written in an era of different sensibilities by slave-holding white supremacists. In Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, in the gift shops, in the museums. Our detractors have a plan. They aren't asking us to forget those documents. They don't want us to forget the Constitution. They don't want us to forget the Declaration of Independence. They want us to remember it differently. They want us to unremember the truth. I'm going to explain that word unremember. I have read and reread this book. My sister, bless her heart, gets me some of the most off-of-the-wall books. And one of them, well, she knows I like these Lord of the Rings fantasy type books. And so she got me one called The Unremembered. The Unremembered. Well, I didn't know what that word meant. I thought you either remember it or you forget it. But they have two very different meanings. To forget something is just to wash it out of your head. It's like, I do not remember doing that. Or I don't remember that at all. However, when you unremember, you're changing something. You're not forgetting it. You're just remembering it differently. How many times do I say this in a day or a week? It's like, that's not the way I remember that. And I'm sure we all do that too. I spend a lot of time talking to my mother, who's 92. And we talk about a lot of our family history. And she'll say, do you remember that time when you were at Uncle Otis's farm out in the country and the mule bit you? I said, I think I would remember when the mule bit me. I said, I remember feeding the mule. And she said, well, I don't remember it that way. She remembered the event, but she didn't quite remember it the way that I remember it. Getting bitten by my Uncle Otis, great Uncle Otis's mule. So to unremember is to change the memory. In this book, The Unremembered, and I do not recommend the book, by the way. I don't recommend the book. All right. But in this book, I found these amazing lines. And it says, change is inevitable and necessary. But the traditions of our fathers need to be preserved. Someone must watch. Someone must remember, and someone must defend. Now, can you imagine Frodo Baggins saying that? It's in one of those kind of books. But this nugget of truth was hidden in a Lord of the Rings type fantasy book. Change is inevitable and necessary. And we're fighting now because people are trying to change. Change is inevitable. But the traditions of our fathers still need to be preserved. Someone must watch, someone must remember, and someone must defend. So today, here, we and countless others across America are gathered, maybe not today, maybe tomorrow, but we're honoring the birthdays of Lee, the memories of Jackson, of our generals. And we don't just honor them, we remember them. We speak their names. We speak the names of our ancestors. We speak the names of the fallen. We flag their graves. And we flag their graves in honor of their service. We honor what they fought for and what some of them died for. And we honor their memories with monuments, with statues, with obelisks, with books, with parades, with ceremonies such as this. We honor our ancestors. And it's not just here in America. I just had the pleasure of visiting with Nancy here and telling her the story about how I was so honored. One day at the Confederate Grey 641 meeting, there were 6 women at a meeting, and a man came in and said, I've got something to tell you that you might be interested in. And he opened an entire new world. Little did he know that one of the women he was speaking to was my mother, and that I traveled to Brazil with work. He told the story about after the war, over 40,000 people left here because they refused to live under a federalist government. They refused to live under an oppressive government. For example, it was passed down in my family that they had come years before from an oppressive government, and they can go again. They'll move again if they have to. Well, I was, through my mother, she came back, her eyes were blazing on fire, this big, saying, you've got to find those people, they're in Brazil. And I said, Mom, Brazil's bigger than the United States, but I'll work on it. I'm not kidding you, just a few weeks later, we had a new destination, a couple of hours outside of São Paulo, Brazil. By the way, São Paulo is the 8th largest city in the world. It's the largest city in South America. 2 hours outside of it is a little town called Americana. And when I got to the hotel, I said, can you tell me what Americana is? That is not a Portuguese name. They said, no, that's where the American Confederate soldiers came after the Civil War, is what they called it. And I said, can you get me there? And I mean, within an hour, I was there taking pictures of the obelisk and learning the history. They have a museum of Confederate immigration. They have an American Confederate museum and a cemetery and a church there. All out in the middle of a sugarcane field, because the churches there would not let the Confederates bury their dead in the churchyards of Brazil, so they built their own. But there's a famous visitor to one of the obelisks, and I don't expect you to be able to see this, but if you'd like to see it a little later, you can come up. I'll leave it open to this. This is a picture of one of the obelisks that's in the cemetery of the Americans in Brazil. And if you look closely, you'll see that that is Governor Jimmy Carter standing at the very same obelisk that I have stood at in the American cemetery in Brazil. You know why he was there? He had ancestors buried in the American cemetery, and Rosalind Carter was there with him. Her uncle, I've been to his grave, is buried there. So there was a book written by a gentleman named Jody Powell. Actually, he's a syndicated columnist. And his column title is Confederacy's Old Times Are Not Forgotten. And this was in January 28th of 1986 when he went there. And this is an excerpt out of his column. He said, Jimmy Carter stood beneath the granite monument to say a few words to the crowd that had gathered there. As he spoke, I found a knot in my throat and tears beginning to trickle down my cheek. Surprised and embarrassed, I looked up to see if anybody had noticed. And then I discovered that Mrs. Carter was having the same problem. A moment later, her husband looked down at us and had to stop his speech to clear the lump in his own throat. None of us could explain exactly why Americana had touched us so deeply. Part of it was the feeling we had discovered a part of ourselves that we hardly knew existed. That feeling came from honoring our ancestors. That feeling, that lump in our throat, that swelling of pride in our hearts, comes from honoring those who led the way for us. We're here today because we stand on the shoulders of giants who came before us. Lee, Jackson, many others. I look at Jerry Peacock. I stand on the shoulders of greatness when I follow in Jerry's steps. Judy and Sandy, Carolyn. I just see the greatness of people who are honoring and acting on the honoring of what they truly believe in. But how do we combat the detractors trying to keep us from remembering, or the ones who are trying to get us to unremember? Well, by our very presence here, now, by the very presence every day. By the way, the young lady who delivered the barbecue, she said, "What's going on? This looks fun." And I said, "It is fun." And Judy jumped in there like I was going to pussyfoot around it or something. She said, "It's a Confederate meeting." And I said, "Well, what it is, it's a Lee Jackson Ball. We're honoring our Confederate ancestors and their memory." She said, "My grandpa has a book that details all of our Confederate ancestors. I'm a descendant as well." Judy said, "Here's my card." So we may have gotten barbecue and a new member of the UDC. But just by our everyday remembering, by our everyday mentioning, it's sort of like in the Christian faith too. You don't always have to say your faith. People see it. People will ask you. She asked, "What are you guys doing? This looks fun." We are the ones who honor. We are the ones who remember our ancestors and talk about our ancestors. Invite new people to honor their ancestors. We're the ones who are defending the traditions of our forefathers and foremothers. And we're the ones who celebrate our Southern heritage. Now, originally my family's from Alabama. I have an aunt there who's my mother's baby sister. She's 86. And I told her that I had the honor to come and make a short presentation to family and friends and soon-to-be family and now friends who are going to be gathered to honor Lee and Jackson. Well, that woman, my aunt, is a fierce Confederate defender. She said, "I have something for you." Up until she was about 80 years old in Birmingham, Alabama, actually just outside Birmingham, she ran. She was a retired executive from Southwestern Bell. And when she retired, she got bored. And she started a quilting shop. She gave quilting lessons. She sold sewing machines. She anything that had to do with quilting. My Aunt Annie was there. She said, "I have something that I look at that causes me to remember my great-grandfather." And she said, "I want you to take it down and please tell people that they can feel free to come up and touch this, because if you're a quilter, you know the cardinal rule: do not touch a quilt, even if you're checking on the seams or anything." She said they have permission to touch it, they have permission to look at it, to hold it out and stretch it out. This is not a quilt from the 1860s. It is an exact replica of a quilt, right down to the material. The brown material, except for the backing, it should be white muslin, and she said I didn't have any, so I put all of these Civil War reenactment scenes on the back, which are kind of interesting too. But the brown material here is hand-dyed cotton. It's all hand-dyed, just as if they would have hand-dyed it in the 1800s. The rest is all recreated fabric from the era. This is exactly what this material looked like. Notice the size of it. This is the size of the beds and the people. They were little. And it's kind of hard being 6'3" to think that I came from 5-footers. But this is what covered the beds. Now, can anyone guess what maybe the pattern would be called on this? Remember, 1860s, out in the country, they didn't have central air and heat. They had to throw blankets on. Well, I will tell you, if you look at it closely, my aunt and my mother were farmed out during the Depression to the farm out in the country where the darn mule bit me. And one of their jobs as little girls was to churn the butter. They would go out and they would milk the cows. They had them all named. and then they would pour the milk, warm milk, into the churn, and then they had a device that would go up and down, up and down, and it was called a dash, or a dasher, a butter dasher. The quilt pattern is churn dash. And if you look at it, you can see looking down on the top of a churn and the churn dash. This is an authentic replica of a Civil War era quilt, right down to the size, the pattern, and the material. Now, why I brought that is because I prefaced it by saying my aunt is a Confederate patriot.
Amen.
This is her way to remember. She can't do much else, but she can quilt, and she had no idea that many people would be seeing this, and that she would be being honored by remembering in the way she can remember. And so, basically, I wanted to close by saying we all have a way to remember, to honor. We speak our names. Our commander, Skinner, he asked me to speak to our group. And he said, tell us something you haven't told us before. And I said, okay, I'll come up with something. And one of the things that ended up was saying, let's each one say the name of our ancestors. If they're on our lips, they're in our hearts. It's the Day of the Dead remembrance every year, every meeting, every time we say their names, we honor and we remember our ancestors. And if it weren't for them, we wouldn't be here today enjoying this wonderful fellowship. So thank you so much for allowing me to come and visit with you and allowing me to show you my aunt's churn dash quilt that she made with love as her way of honoring our Confederate and Southern heritage and ancestry. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it.